My father stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table, looked around at 22 relatives holding their silverware, and said 5 words I have heard every single day since. Nora is no longer ours. I was 15 years old, 3 months pregnant. The turkey hadn't been touched. Nobody moved. My aunt pressed her lips together. My cousin stared at her plate. My mother, Sandra, folded her napkin once, twice, and set it beside her glass without looking up. My father pulled out his chair, sat back down, and reached for the carving knife like he'd just announced a change in dinner plans. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door and walked out into a November night, so cold the air cut through my shirt before I reached the bottom of the porch steps. I didn't cry. I just walked, and as I walked, one thought kept circling. The baby I was carrying would never sit at that table. I didn't know yet whether that was a tragedy or a gift. 16 years later, when my parents drove 9 hours straight to my front door and knocked until their knuckles were red, asking to meet the grandson they'd heard about from a cousin at a church picnic, I finally had my answer. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're watching from. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed property manager in Asheville, North Carolina, and the mother of a 15-year-old boy named Eli, who is without question the best thing I have ever done. This is the story of how my family threw me away at 15 and spent 16 years pretending a whole human being didn't exist, and what happened the afternoon they showed up on my doorstep expecting to be called grandparents. Now let me take you back to Bridgeford, Kentucky. Population 6,200. One stoplight, one Dairy Queen, 2 Baptist churches, and a set of unspoken rules about who you were allowed to be depending on whose house you grew up in. The Callahans were not wealthy, but we were respectable. That word, respectable, was my father Robert's North Star. He said it the way other men say amen. He managed the local branch of a regional credit union for 21 years. He wore collared shirts on Saturdays. He coached my brother Danny's Little League team for 4 seasons and was photographed for the Bridgeford Courier 3 times. My mother Sandra taught Sunday school and organized the annual coat drive. They were the kind of people the town held up as examples. Inside our house on Wren Street, the rules were simpler. Danny was the future, and I was the helper. Not stated out loud, just the architecture of everything. Danny's baseball games were non-negotiable, Saturdays blocked off from April to August. My swim meets were listed on the fridge in pencil. No ink, no permanence. Danny got the downstairs bedroom with the carpet. I got the upstairs one with the radiator that clicked all night. When I made honor roll in 8th grade, my mother said that's wonderful and handed me a grocery list. When Danny made JV quarterback in 9th, my father rented a room at Shirley's Bar and Grill for a party of 40. I wasn't angry about it. I was just quiet. I'd learned early that quiet was the safest place to be in that house. His name was Caleb Marsh. He was 17. Junior year, worked weekends at the gas station on Route 12, drove a truck that sounded like it was always 2 miles from dying. I was 15, and I thought the way he looked at me, like I was actually there, like I was actually worth looking at, was what love felt like. It probably wasn't. We were children. But for a few months, it was the realest thing in my life. I found out I was pregnant in late August, 2 weeks before 10th grade started. I took 3 tests in the bathroom at the Walgreens on Maple, paid cash, $7.49 each. I sat on the toilet lid and stared at 3 identical pink lines for 20 minutes. Then I put them in the bottom of my backpack, went home, made dinner, helped Danny with his history homework, and didn't say a word to anyone. I told my parents on a Sunday night in September. I picked Sunday because my father was always calmer after church. He'd have coffee at the kitchen table, read the paper, say a few easy things to my mother about the sermon. I thought if I caught him in that window, the soft one between faith and the week ahead, it might go differently. It didn't. My mother sat very still. The kind of still that isn't peace, but it's opposite. Every muscle locked in place to keep from shattering. My father set down his coffee cup. Slowly, deliberately. The way you set something down when you're deciding whether to throw it. Then he said, "Who knows?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What do you need?" Not even, "How did this happen?" Just, "Who knows?" "Nobody," I said. "Keep it that way." He stood up, walked to the back door, and stood there looking out at the yard for what felt like a full minute. "We'll handle this quietly. You'll take care of it, and we won't speak of it again." I knew what take care of it meant. I also knew, sitting at that kitchen table with my hands in my lap, that I wasn't going to. I told him that. The window closed. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my parents have a conversation about my life that I was not invited to join. I heard pieces of it through walls, around corners, in the too quiet way they talked when I was nearby. Sandra was afraid of what the church would say. Robert was afraid of what the town would say. Danny didn't know anything. He was 18, starting his senior year, focused on applications to UK and Louisville. His future was being carefully constructed in the other room, while mine was being quietly dismantled in this one. I kept going to school. I sat in my classes, turned in my work, swam 2 practices a week until my stomach made it impossible to hide. I was 5 feet 2 inches and 15 years old, and by the time November came, I could feel it in the waistband of every pair of jeans I owned. Thanksgiving was the day my father ran out of patience for the quiet approach. His sister Carol was there with her husband and 3 kids. His brother Ray and Ray's wife Deborah from Lexington. My grandmother Patsy, who was 74 and needed a cane now, but still made the corn pudding nobody else could replicate. 22 people at 2 tables pushed together in the dining room, the good china out, the fall wreath on the door. I was helping carry the side dishes from the kitchen. I set down the green beans. I went back for the rolls. I came back, and my father was standing at the head of the table, napkin in one hand, and he was looking at me the way he'd been looking at me for 2 months, like I was a problem he'd failed to solve. He didn't warn me. He didn't ask me to leave the room first. He just said it. "Before we say grace, there's something the family should know. Nora is no longer our daughter. She made her choice. We've made ours." 22 people. Silence. The refrigerator hum from the kitchen. Outside, a car passing slow on Wren Street. My grandmother Patsy made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes out when something hits you before you've had time to prepare. "Robert." That was Carol. Low, careful. "It's done." My father sat down, reached for the carving knife. "Let's eat." I don't remember deciding to leave. I just remember being at the door, code in hand. I remember Patsy half rising from her chair, her cane catching on the table leg. And I remember thinking, please don't. Please just let me go without a scene, because a scene would make it real in a way I couldn't survive yet. I walked out. The door clicked shut behind me. November in Bridgeford is cold and flat and dark by 5. I walked 4 blocks to Caleb's house and knocked. He opened the door with a chip bag in his hand and took one look at my face. He didn't say anything. He just stepped back and let me in. He was a 17-year-old kid with a chip bag and no plan. I want to be fair about that. He wasn't a villain. He was just a boy who wasn't ready for any of this, and I knew it even then. He let me sleep on their couch that night. His mother, Janet, tired woman, night shift at the textile plant, 3 kids, 1 bathroom, came home at midnight, found me there, and didn't ask me to leave. She put a blanket over me and set a glass of water on the floor beside the couch and went to bed. Janet Marsh is the reason I believed for a long time that kindness was something ordinary people could choose to do. She wasn't warm exactly. She was just decent. In that season of my life, decent felt like a miracle. I stayed with the Marshes for 3 weeks. Then a teacher found out. Her name was Mrs. Elaine Dodd. She taught English and ran the school's literary magazine. She was 55, recently divorced, drove a green Subaru that was always full of student papers, and had a house 4 blocks from the school, with a spare bedroom she'd been using for storage since her daughter went to college. She called me into her classroom after school on a Wednesday, closed the door, and said, "You're not going back to Wren Street, are you?" It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment, looked out the window. Then she said, "My daughter's room has a real bed. The radiator works. You'd have to help with dishes." I stared at her. "I'm a mandatory reporter," she said carefully, "which means I've already made a report. The county knows. But the county is slow, and you don't have weeks. So until something formal gets sorted, you're going to come home with me tonight." I carried everything I owned in a single backpack, 2 changes of clothes, my school laptop, a library book I hadn't returned, $43 in birthday money from my grandmother Patsy, and a sonogram photo from my first appointment that I'd folded into the front pocket. I lived with Elaine Dodd for 6 months. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Not as a boarder, not as a burden, as someone she decided to take responsibility for because she could, and because she believed it was right. She drove me to every prenatal appointment in that green Subaru. She sat in the waiting room and graded papers while I was seen. She never told me what to do, or who to be, or how to feel. She did tell me once, sitting at her kitchen table over soup she'd made from whatever was in the refrigerator, "You're going to be a good mother because you already know what it looks like when that job gets done wrong. Use it." I wrote that down. I still have it. My parents did not call. Danny texted once, in December. 3 words, "You okay, sis?" I wrote back, "I'm okay." He never wrote again. I don't blame him. He was 18 in a house with Robert Callahan, and that was its own kind of survival. Eli Robert Callahan was born on March 14th at 4:22 in the afternoon at Bridgeford Regional Medical Center. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Brown hair. Eyes that couldn't decide between gray and blue for the first several weeks. I named him Eli because Elaine had told me during one of our kitchen table conversations that Eli in the Bible was the one who listened, who kept vigil in the dark, who showed up for the child no one else was watching. Robert was his middle name. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't for my father. It was because I needed to put that name somewhere it could exist without hurting me, where I could look at it and decide, over time, what it meant. He was the most real thing I had ever seen. Caleb held him once in the hospital for maybe 4 minutes. He looked down at Eli the way you look at something you know is bigger than you. Then he handed him back and said quietly, "I can't do this, Nora." No anger, no excuse, just a fact, like reading a weather forecast. I told him I knew. I told him to go. He signed the paperwork. I never saw him again. I stayed in Bridgeford for 2 more years, long enough to finish school. Elaine kept her spare room available. I got a part-time job at the pharmacy on Main, $9.25 an hour, and saved every dollar I didn't spend on diapers. I brought Eli to the library on Tuesday mornings in a carrier while I did my coursework at one of the public computers in the back. I graduated with my class in June, walked across the Bridgeford High stage in a cap and gown, with a 2-year-old in the audience being held by a retired English teacher who was crying before my name was called. My parents were not there. I looked. I couldn't help it. My grandmother Patsy was. She'd driven herself, which her doctor had told her not to do. She was sitting in the fourth row with her cane propped against the seat beside her, wearing her church cardigan. Afterward, she held Eli for the first time, looked at him for a long moment without saying anything, and then looked at me. "He's got your eyes," she said. "Don't let anyone tell him who he is before he figures it out himself." I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, the summer Eli turned 3. I'd found a listing for a property management trainee position at a company called Blue Ridge Residential. Full-time. Benefits at 60 days. Training provided. I put everything we owned into the back of a 1999 Corolla I'd bought for $2,800 from a coworker at the pharmacy. I drove us south on I-26 with Eli strapped in his car seat eating goldfish crackers, talking to himself about something only he found interesting. I didn't tell my parents we were leaving. I sent a postcard to Patsy with my new address and one line, "We're good, Grandma." I put her number in my phone under the name Patsy with a small cardinal emoji because she'd told me once that cardinals were messages from people who'd already gone on ahead. I want to tell you about the years that followed, because this story is not only about the wound. It's also about everything that grew up around it. Blue Ridge Residential managed 12 properties when I started. By the time I'd been there 4 years, I'd helped grow it to 34. I got licensed at 22, promoted to senior property manager at 25. My boss, a woman named Deb Hartwell who ran everything with a spreadsheet and a thermos of cold brew, told me during my 5-year review that I managed my properties like someone who understood what it meant for a building to be someone's only safe place. I told her she was right. I didn't explain why. At 26, I took out a small business loan and bought a 12-unit complex on the east side of Asheville. FHA loan, $187,000, co-signed by Deb Hartwell, who said she'd rather risk $15,000 than watch me undervalue myself for another 5 years. The complex needed work. I did most of it myself on weekends, Eli handing me tools he'd named after characters from whatever book he was reading at the time. He was 10 then. He called the socket wrench Atticus. By the time I was 30, the complex was fully occupied, cash flow positive, and had a wait list. I had a second property under contract in West Asheville. I drove a used Highlander I'd paid off 8 months early. I had a savings account with more than $400 in it for the first time in my adult life. And then there was Eli. Let me tell you about Eli. He was the kid teachers called an old soul, and actually meant it. He read everything. He asked questions that started with, "But why actually?" He had 2 close friends, a rescue dog named Stanley he'd adopted at age 9 from the shelter on Marymount Avenue, and a habit of writing letters, actual letters on paper, to people he wanted to say real things to. He wrote to Elaine Dodd every few months. She wrote back on school letterhead. He kept everyone in a shoebox under his bed. He knew who his grandparents were. I never lied to him. I told him, at an age I judged to be right, "Your grandfather Robert said some things when I was young that meant we stopped being family. Your grandmother Sandra stayed quiet when she could have spoken up. They've never met you. That's their loss, not yours." He thought about this for a while. Then he said, "Do they know I exist?" "They know I was pregnant," I said. "What happened after that?" They never asked. He nodded, went back to his book. Then 2 pages later, "Would you tell me if they tried to find us?" "Yes," I said. "Always." That conversation happened when he was 11. When he was 14, they tried. The call came through Patsy. My grandmother, 88 years old, still sharp enough to run a Tuesday crossword in pen, called me on a Friday evening in October. Her voice had the careful quality it got when she'd been sitting with something for a while. "Your mother called me," she said. I set down my coffee. She heard something at Carol's daughter's wedding back in August. Someone who knew someone from the old swim team. Said they'd heard you were in North Carolina. Said you had a boy. I waited. She wants an address, Nora. Patsy paused. I didn't give it. I told her I'd tell you she called. That's all I could do and stay honest. That's all I'd ever ask, I said. She cried. Not as an argument. Just a fact, same as always. I know, I said. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. Eli was at a friend's house. Stanley was asleep on the couch. Outside, October in Asheville was doing what it does, turning the hills into something that looks almost too beautiful to be real. I thought about what I'd promised Eli. I would tell him if they tried. I thought about what it meant that for 14 years they had not. I thought about Thanksgiving, the carving knife, the good china, 22 people, and a door that clicked shut. I thought about a green Subaru full of student papers and a spare bedroom, and soup made from whatever was in the refrigerator. I called Patsy back and gave her a message to pass along. If Robert and Sandra Callahan wanted to speak with me, they could write a letter to the address I would mail to Patsy. Not email, a letter. And I would decide from there. I did not expect a letter. 3 weeks later, one arrived. Not from my mother, from my father. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, tight, heavy-pressed, the penmanship of a generation that was graded on it. I stood at the mailbox for a moment before I opened it. Then I went inside, poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and read 2 pages. I will not share all of it. Some of it belongs to me. But the parts that matter. He said he'd heard I had a son. He said he thought about that a lot. He said he wanted to meet him. He said, I know I was hard on you. You have to understand that what you did embarrassed this family in front of everyone we knew. You were 15, and you should have made better choices. He said, your mother misses you. We're getting older. We'd like the chance to know our grandson. He signed it, Dad. I read it twice. Then I went back and read that line again. You should have made better choices. Let me tell you what a letter like that is. It is not an apology. It is a resumption. It is a man who has spent 16 years building a version of events in which he remains correct, who has now decided that his desire for a grandchild outweighs his need to maintain the silence he chose. It is someone knocking on a door they locked from the inside, and expecting you to be grateful they finally found the key. I thought about Eli's question. I told him that night. I read him the letter, the whole thing. He was 14, and he had earned the truth. He listened with the focused stillness he got when something mattered. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you embarrassed the family. He did. You were 15. I was. Another pause. He didn't apologize. No. Eli looked at the letter once more. Then he said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. Does he know I'm right here? That I've been here the whole time? He knows you exist, I said. He doesn't know who you are. My son handed me back the letter. What are you going to do? I'm going to write back. And I want you to tell me if there's anything you want me to say. He thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, he came into the kitchen before school and said, tell him I'm not something they get to want after they already decided they didn't. I wrote that down. I worked it into the letter. Now let me ask you something directly. And I want you to think about this before you answer in the comments. If your parents had thrown you out at 15, never called for 16 years, and then written you a letter asking to meet your child, would you have written back? Or would you have kept walking? Tell me below. I read every single one. My response was 1 page. I told my father I had received his letter. I told him I had a son, that his name was Eli, and that he was extraordinary in ways they had forfeited the right to witness. I told him that the phrase better choices told me everything I needed to know about whether a genuine reckoning had taken place. I told him I didn't need an apology for myself, that I had built a life requiring nothing from them, but that if they ever wanted any part of Eli's life, the price of entry was honesty. Not nostalgia, not convenience. Honesty. I wrote, "You are asking to meet a grandson, but to meet him, you have to first meet me. The 15-year-old girl you sent out into a November night in front of 22 people is still in this body. She doesn't disappear because 16 years passed. You don't get to skip past her to get to the boy." I sent the letter and didn't hear back for 6 weeks. And then they drove 9 hours and knocked on my door. It was a Saturday in February, 7:40 in the morning. I was in the kitchen making breakfast. Eli was still asleep. Stanley was at the front door before I heard anything. That low, certain sound he made when something outside required my attention. I looked through the window. A silver Buick I didn't recognize. Kentucky plates. I knew before I opened the door. My father was shorter than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. He'd been tall in my memory, filled a doorframe, a table, a room. The man on my porch was 67 years old, reading glasses in his shirt pocket, gray at the temples he hadn't had at 48, a jacket that fit the way jackets fit men who've lost weight slowly and without meaning to. My mother stood half a step behind him, hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting to be called on. I had not seen either of them in 16 years. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. My father cleared his throat. "We should have called." "Yes," I said. "We drove through the night." My mother's voice was smaller than I remembered. She'd always had a careful voice, the kind that didn't commit to anything. Now it sounded like it was working hard just to stay steady. "We didn't want to give you the chance to say no before you heard us." "That's a choice you made," I said. They stood on my porch. I stood in my doorway. The February sun was flat and pale and cold. A neighbor walked past with a dog that was interested in everything. Somewhere down the street, someone was already mowing. "Before I decide whether he ever knows you're here," I said, "you're going to sit at my kitchen table and answer some questions. Honestly, without the version of events where I'm the one who made the mistakes." My mother's eyes went bright. She nodded once. My father looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not quite shame, but in the same zip code. "Okay," he said. "Okay." I stepped back, held the door open. They came inside. I made coffee. I moved through my kitchen the way I moved through everything in my life now. Not rushed, not performed, just deliberate. My kitchen, my coffee, my 12-unit complex on the east side of town, my life on the shelves and windowsills, a property management license in a frame Eli had picked out, his 8th grade school photo, a $5 plant on the counter from the hardware store on Merrimon that was somehow still alive, a postcard from Elaine Dodd tacked to the cabinet that said simply, "Look how far." We sat at the table, the one I bought at an estate sale for $40 when we first moved to Asheville. I'd refinished it myself over a weekend with Eli sitting across from me, eating crackers, offering opinions on the stain color. It had marks on it now, homework rings, a scratch from a model ship project, a small burn from a Christmas candle that tipped. I asked my father one question first. "Tell me exactly what you did. Not what I did, not what led to it, not what the town thought or what the church said. Tell me what you did." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I heard the heat kick on, heard a car pass outside, heard, distantly, the sound of Eli's alarm going off down the hall. Then my father said, "I announced to my family that you weren't our daughter anymore. In front of everyone, when you were 15 years old and pregnant and scared. And I told Sandra to say nothing, and she didn't." My mother made a sound beside him, small, like a word that couldn't make it all the way out. "And after that," I said, "we didn't call." He looked at his hands. "We didn't check on you. We didn't ask what happened to the. He stopped, started again. We didn't ask about the baby. For 16 years. We just didn't ask. The kitchen was quiet. Stanley had come in from the hallway, looked at the strangers at my table, looked at me, and settled at my feet. Good dog. His name is Eli, I said. He's 15 years old. He reads constantly and asks questions that make adults uncomfortable. He writes letters to people he loves on actual paper. He has a dog named Stanley and a best friend named Marcus. And he got his library card renewed 3 times because he maxed out the checkout limit. He wants to manage properties someday. He told me this at age 10, like it was already decided. My parents were looking at me with an expression I had never seen from either of them before. Not quite love, or maybe love, but the honest kind, the kind that comes carrying the full weight of what it cost. You raised him, my mother said. It wasn't a question. I did. By yourself. With help, I said. Not from you. She nodded. I watched her hands shake slightly on the table before she pressed them flat and steadied them. I heard Eli's door, his footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of someone comfortable taking up exactly the amount of space they need. I had heard those footsteps for 15 years. Stanley lifted his head. Eli came into the kitchen in a sweatshirt and socks, hair still pushed sideways from sleep, holding his phone. He saw them before they saw him. He stopped in the doorway. My father turned, saw him. I watched something happen in that old man's face that I was not prepared for. Not pride. He hadn't earned pride. Something rawer than that. The look of a person confronted, at last and without warning, with everything they chose not to see. Eli looked at me. I looked back at him. This was the moment I had imagined in 100 different versions. Angry versions. Graceful ones. Versions where I said the perfect thing and versions where I said nothing at all. But here is what actually happened. My son walked to the counter, poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the sink the way he always did, and said to no one in particular, I figured this might happen eventually. He looked at my father, steadily, the way he looked at everything that mattered. I know who you are, Eli said. Mom doesn't lie. He took a slow sip of water. I'm not ready to have a conversation with you. I want you to know that's not permanent, but it's true right now. He looked at my mother. Either of you. My mother's chin trembled. But I'm glad you came, he said, because now she doesn't have to wonder if you would. He looked at me, something in his face that was partly mine and partly his own, something built in a house I had made for him. Over 15 years of deciding every day what mattered. I'm going to take Stanley for a walk. You okay? I'm okay, I said. He snapped his fingers at Stanley, who was already on his feet. He grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door, opened it, paused, and without turning back, he said one more thing, quiet, clear, the way he said everything that was final. The grandson you came here for? He's mine. He's always been mine. You're just meeting him now. The door closed. The kitchen was very still. My father looked at the door for a long time. Then he looked at his hands on my table. When he spoke, his voice was lower than I'd ever heard it. He's something, he said. He is, I said. He always has been. You just didn't know it. That was 3 months ago. My father calls on Sunday evenings now. Not every week, but most of them. He and Eli have talked twice. Short conversations. Baseball. The property in West Asheville. A book Eli was reading that my father had also read decades ago and had never expected to discuss with anyone. They're figuring out what it looks like, the two of them. I don't rush it. I don't engineer it. I just make sure the door I'm choosing to leave open is one I'm opening myself, not one being pushed from the outside. My mother sent a card at Christmas. Inside, just 2 lines. I am more sorry than I know how to say. I am learning to say it anyway. I keep it. I haven't responded yet, but I keep it. Danny called in March. First time in 16 years, voice exactly the same and nothing like what I remembered. He said, I should have texted back. I know that. I told him he was 18 and scared, and that I understood. He said that wasn't enough of a reason. I told him we had time, if he wanted to use it. He said he did. We're figuring out what that looks like. Elaine Dodd came to Asheville in April. Eli took her to his favorite bookstore on Lexington Avenue and spent an hour showing her every book he thought she needed to read. She bought 6. She cried when she hugged me in the parking lot and said, I told you. She didn't have to tell me what she told me. I already knew. Here is what I want to say to you before I go. My parents drove 9 hours looking for a grandson. What they found was a 15-year-old boy who already knew exactly who he was, because his mother had spent 15 years making sure he had the space and the safety to figure it out. The grandson they imagined, the one who would slide into their lives and fill the space their absence created, the one who would call them grandma and grandpa at the Thanksgiving table like no time had passed, that boy doesn't exist. He never did. That boy was built in their minds during 16 years of not asking, not calling, not wondering. He was a fantasy assembled from guilt and regret, and the ticking of a clock they'd ignored for too long. What exists is Eli, real, entire, belonging to himself. Not a consolation prize for people who got their timing wrong. Not a second chance distributed for free. Not a grandson conjured by need. He is my son. He has been my son through a couch at the Marshes and a spare bedroom at Elaine's and a 1999 Corolla on I-26 and a $40 estate sale table and a 12-unit complex on the east side of Asheville. He existed every single day they chose not to ask. So when my parents knocked on my door begging for the grandson they'd heard about at a cousin's church picnic, they were not wrong that he existed. They were wrong about who he belonged to. He was never theirs to beg for. He was mine, and I built him well. If you are the person who was sent out a door that should have stayed open, if you were 15 or 17 or 22, and the people who were supposed to hold you let you go instead, I want you to hear this as clearly as I can say it. Everything you built after that door closed is yours, not theirs. Not partially, not subject to revision when they decide the timing is finally right for them. Yours. Healing is not the same as reunion. Forgiveness is not the same as access. And loving someone, even someone who failed you at the moment you needed them most, does not require handing them back the parts of your life they missed. The door to my house is mine. I decide who walks through it. I decide under what terms and at what pace. And for the first time in my life, that is not a lonely thing. It is the only thing that has ever made me feel safe. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 31 years old. I own a building in Asheville, North Carolina. I have a son who writes letters on paper and argues about literature, and named the socket wrench Atticus. I have a dog named Stanley and a $5 plant that is somehow miraculously still alive on my kitchen counter. I was thrown away at 15. I became everything anyway. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story found you somewhere real, if you've been the person standing outside on the porch, or the person deciding whether to open the door, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to hear another story about someone who built a life from the pieces they were left with, I've linked it in the description below. I think you'll recognize yourself in it. Like and subscribe if you want more. And wherever you are tonight, take care of yourself. You've been doing it longer than people know. See you in the next one.